Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Let's start with the Russians, or with Brexit. But I try this. Sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't. As a general rule, I can't really conduct Brexit conversations without the fence appearing almost immediately, and it's not my fault. It's not your fault. It's just the way that the whole debate has unfolded. It became psychological some time ago, didn't it, as opposed to political. So that kind of entrenchment is part of every contemplation of the issue. And of course, the needle isn't moving much. Those of us who thought that as more and more reality bit, as more and more facts emerged, more and more people would see the error of their ways. That isn't really happening. Most of the polls suggest that it is happening, but not anything like on a scale that you could realistically describe as significant. And the reason for that must be psychological as opposed to political, because, you know, the evidence is irresistible. You may not have seen the Australian, oh man alive, I should try and share this with you. It's a couple of weeks old, I forgot to tell you. The Australians have published their attitudes to future trade deals with us. You remember how quite often these people say, oh well, we should trade with Australia. They speak English and they're mostly white. It'll be marvellous. Australia have told us what they think about future prospects of trading with us. There's a reason why you won't have read about it in any Brexit-supporting newspapers, but you should have heard it on this evidence-based programme. Actually, can we do that? Can we dig that out? It's on Steve Pearce's Twitter feed, the Emperor's New Sea guy. He's brilliant. Can get me the whole thing. It's a couple of weeks old. It's amazing, this. It's like journalism happening live on the radio. What do you mean journalism? You've just asked someone to dig out someone else's 2-week-old tweets. Yeah, all right. It's a living. Speaking of things that have taken rather a long time to rise up the news agenda, it was back in March of this year that it was reported Philip Hammond had refused to pay back more than £800,000 the Conservatives had received in donations from Russian oligarchs. He insisted, and I think continues to do so, that the cash is legitimate. That, of course, so the 11th of March, that was reported in The Independent on Sunday. And it may explain why it is reported today that Theresa May turned down a request. And I want you to pay attention to this because it's, well, for my money, it's quite important. Theresa May turned down a request from the security services to investigate Arron Banks and his financing of elements of the Leave campaign. Why? Oh, 3, 4, 5. No, I'm joking. I wonder, and I am just wondering out loud, whether or not those two stories are connected. Philip Hammond declined to turn down £800,000 received from Russian oligarchs. Theresa May declined a request. Reportedly, it's in the Mail. Mail's gone absolutely brilliant today. I told you it was changing, but I wasn't expecting it to change quite this fast. Their front page is an absolute U-turn. Blood on their hands. In a crisis for Prime Minister, Minister quits over crack cocaine betting machines costing gambling addicts lives, and in a savage swipe she accuses government of having blood on their hands. But the bit that really suggests a change of direction, as police probe Brexit bad boy Arron Banks, did Russian money help fund his £8 million Leave campaign? I don't know, nor do you. The National Crime Agency is the British equivalent of the FBI. The fact that the case has been referred to them as opposed to Scotland Yard or a police service may be significant. I'm not going to pretend I've got the depth of knowledge to know just how significant, but it's not a good look, is it? Being investigated by the National Crime Agency over suspicions regarding millions of pounds that was spent on persuading people to vote one way in a referendum. Because, of course, it's against the law for illegal, or I beg your pardon, for foreign donors to make donations to political movements or parties during an election period, and the referendum, of course, constitutes an election period. That's why Philip Hammond isn't compelled or in any trouble for taking £800,000, because it's not during an election period. It may seem like a perforated line, but it's a significant one.
£8 million from potentially impermissible sources. The Electoral Commission already said it suspected Arron Banks was not the true source of all the huge donations and loans to a pro-Brexit group. Well, today that watchdog dramatically upped the ante by handing the case over to the National Crime Agency. It said it would investigate whether the funding by Mr. Banks, along with a number of individuals and organisations linked to him, broke electoral law during the 2016 referendum. Mr. Banks welcomed the inquiry, So just where did that cash come from? Here's our political correspondent, Michael Crick.
Arron Banks gave or lent more than £8 million to various Brexit organisations during the referendum.
What would you like to say to us?
Indeed, he's thought to be the biggest single donor to any campaign in British history. But now the Electoral Commission has referred him and his funding to the National Crime Agency, the highest police body in the land. The Commission say they've reasonable grounds to suspect that Mr. Banks and his firms were not the true source of the £8 million, that he and others concealed the true details of these financial transactions, and that various criminal offences may have been committed. Arron Banks shot to fame 4 years ago when he announced from the lawn of his lavish country home that he was giving £1 million to UKIP.
Well, someone has to fund us. You know, we have to have money. We haven't got...
It was the size of that gift and his cheeky manner which prompted questions then and ever since as to how rich Banks really is and how he made his money.
Point as well. I'm a self-made person. I made my money from a desk and 2 telephones, so I resent your kind of comment that I'm some sort of rich Tory.
The Electoral Commission today said they don't have the powers to investigate Mr. Banks' Isle of Man company, Rock Holdings, or his companies based in Gibraltar, all of which by law are banned from funding British election campaigns as they're offshore. And recently the question's also arisen as to whether the funds for Brexit really came from Russia. In his book, Banks reveals he had a 6-hour boozy lunch, his words, at the Russian embassy with the ambassador. And it's since emerged there were other meetings at which Banks was offered the chance to take part in lucrative deals involving gold mines and diamonds. Kathy Newman recently asked the Russian ambassador about it.
And he was one of the persons, whom we meet because, I was curious why he's giving so much money.
Then there's the Southern African connection. Earlier this year, Channel 4 News investigated several diamond mines in the region, which Mr. Banks had once said were one source of his wealth.
Diamond mines?
Diamond mines, yes, in Kimberley. We own 7 mines there, not all of them, but there's quite a cluster. And,
what's that worth?
Quite a lot.
But we found several mines shut, and evidence they'd been losing money and struggled to pay wages.
You understand that there's no people that come, there's no production there.
No production at all?
No production at all.
In court documents, Banks's former business partner in the mines claimed Banks had tried to plug the financial hole with Russian cash. But some of those funds, he alleged, were diverted to pay for Brexit.
The Leave campaign won the referendum.
Arron Banks has always denied such allegations, but when MPs tried to ask him about the source of his wealth earlier this summer, he ended up walking out.
I'm sorry, but there it is.
Mr. Banks, who's fishing in Bermuda right now, today issued this statement.
I am pleased that the Electoral Commission has referred me to the National Crime Agency. I am confident that a full and frank investigation will finally put an end to the ludicrous allegations levelled against me and my colleagues. There is no evidence of any wrongdoing from the companies I own. I am a UK taxpayer and I have never received any foreign donations. The Electoral Commission has produced no evidence to the contrary. The Electoral Commission has referred me to the National Crime Agency under intense political pressure from anti-Brexit supporters.
When I got hold of Arron Banks on the telephone this afternoon, he insisted that all the money he gave and lent to the Brexit campaigns was ultimately his money. The profits in large part, he says, of his insurance business, in which he has 500,000 motoring customers and a turnover of more than £250 million a year. And he complained that the allegations that the Electoral Commission was making had not been put directly to him before they sent them to the National Crime Agency. But the Electoral Commission replied to us tonight that they've had extensive correspondence with Mr. Banks on these matters and his colleague Elizabeth Bilney. Their answers changed over time, the Commission told us, and company accounts and bank account records they allege were not consistent with what they said.
Michael Crick reporting. Well, earlier I spoke to Damien Collins MP, who chairs the Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Committee. The panel recently summoned Arron Banks to give evidence for its inquiry into fake news and disinformation. I began by asking him whether he felt vindicated by today's announcement of a formal investigation.
Well, yes, the concern we expressed in our committee report in the summer, it would seem is shared by the Electoral Commission as well. We said that if it wasn't clear what the real source of the funds were that allowed Arron Banks to make these very large donations to Leave.eu, then it should be referred to the National Crime Agency to investigate. And the Electoral Commission have come to the same conclusion.
And these allegations, of course, you've looked into the truth behind these allegations. You yourself haven't been able to come up with any answers about where this money came from.
Well, no. When Arron Banks gave evidence to the committee, we weren't convinced by his answers that it was at all clear what the source of the money was. He seemed to have a series of businesses that didn't really seem to make any money. Businesses that had been sold by him, again, didn't seem to have brought much of a gain. So that's why we said it wasn't clear based on the evidence we'd received. And the NCA have got greater powers than we have as a parliamentary committee, and they should investigate if it wasn't clear. Right. And obviously the Electoral Commission share the same view.
What's clear in Arron Banks' mind is that he sees this all as a political campaign by people like you to derail Brexit.
Well, it's actually very simple. If he was able to demonstrate to the Electoral Commission what the real source of his funds were, then it wouldn't have been referred. And the Electoral Commission are not just referring it on the basis of doubts they have. They've been very specific that they don't believe that all the funds came from him. And they've named a business in the Isle of Man which they believe was one of the sources of these funds.
I mean, your committee has taken these allegations very seriously. Is one of the big problems for you that the government, that Theresa May, the Prime Minister, doesn't want to touch these allegations with a barge pole for political reasons?
Well, I think political reasons shouldn't stop the investigation of potential breaches of the law. The electoral law is important and it exists and it must be enforced. I think the government would probably say, though, that the correct enforcement here is not by ministers but by the relevant investigatory authorities. And I'm glad that at long last we now have the NCA looking at these issues.
But you can't divorce this from politics. I mean, Arron Banks thinks it is entirely politically motivated.
Well, I think he's doing that to offer up something of a smokescreen, to try and make out that he's some sort of a victim. But why should it be that if someone who's a highly connected political person may have committed electoral offences, why shouldn't they be investigated? Why is politics an excuse not to investigate somebody?
Let me ask you very bluntly, if it can be proven at the end of the day that there was foreign interference of one form or another in the referendum, should the result of that referendum be scrapped?
Well, I think there are two really important things here. Firstly, the investigations into individuals or campaigns that have done wrong, and if they have, they should face charges and prosecution for offences if they have committed them. The issue of whether that affects the outcome of the referendum as a whole is ultimately not a decision for the police or the National Crime Agency. That ultimately is a decision for the British people and for Parliament. And I don't think we could really speculate on that until we know whether these offences have been committed.
Damien Collins, thank you very much.
Thank you.
8 minutes after 10. So how are we going to do this today? I'd quite like, because yesterday was pretty close to being one of the best days of my working life. I don't want to have any fights today. I want to keep it all sweet and gentle and kind. But the people I sort of need to talk to are the people who will still furiously resist the notion of an informed referendum, even if it turns out that foreign money was spent on manipulating the vote. And the reason for this is that people who have been conned rarely recognise the fact that they've been conned. Some people go to their grave still thinking that there's £18 million about to arrive in their bank account from Addis Ababa, and they just need to keep sending a few more cheques to their friend on the internet who will then be able to get the money out of the country that the government minister died having squirreled away in a secret Swiss bank account. People go to their graves like that because admitting the mistake, the error, the con, the grift is too big. It's too difficult to do. I think we're probably all a little bit like that inside ourselves. We'd much rather believe that we hadn't done something silly or wrong. So for me, this is about what has happened to democracy. This is about subversion, and this is also about Russia. And it reminds me of the very first time I invited my friend Bill Browder into this studio. At the time, Bill was little known, it's fair to say, outside of financial circles and the sort of upper echelons of foreign correspondence. But Bill's life's work now is dedicated to unmasking Vladimir Putin as a man who has robbed the Russian people blind, and of course also embarked upon a regime of murderous interventions in countries very, very far away from Russia, places, for example, like Salisbury and London. So what he explained to me a few years ago on this programme, and at the time I sat there with a mixture of dropped jaw and horror. What he explained to me was that Putin's mission really to retain power and hang on to all the money that he's stolen, because the two are absolutely inextricable. Well, you know what happens to corrupt dictators when they get deposed. They lose all their money. They might be able to stick some in a suitcase and run away to Switzerland, but they do not control the hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds that they previously had access to. And in order to do that, his top priority is preventing the Russian people from rising up against his corrupt kleptocracy in the way that they did in Ukraine. And the way to do that is to destabilize everywhere else, so that you don't have, as you did with the Ukraine, the sense of the population looking to the west as opposed to the east and deciding, hang on, I'll have a bit of that. I don't want to labour under this kind of life anymore. I want some Western liberal democracy. So what has Vladimir Putin done over the last few years? He has actually come close to destroying Western liberal democracy. You have basically a fascist now in the White House. You have the far right on the rise in European Union countries like Hungary and Poland, destabilising the European Union, not on a scale like Brexit. That's, I mean, a huge tactic of destabilisation. So it makes the West look shaky. And how shaky are we looking at the moment? Do you know what the Russians, it was reported in the Times yesterday, do you know what they spend the most amount of money and effort on doing to people in this country, using fake internet accounts and social media and sock puppeting and trolling and bots? Do you know what it is? You'd be surprised, I think, when I tell you. What of all these sort of areas of division in modern Britain, which would you say had been most successfully amplified and ignited in recent years? Yeah, you're right. The Russians have spent more money and effort on trying to sow Islamophobia in Western societies than on anything else at all. Why? A destabilised West does not offer up a more attractive alternative to people living under tyranny in the East. And if people living under tyranny in the East don't overthrow their leaders, then their leaders get to hang on to all the money that they've stolen. There's a story Bill tells that involves the leading oligarch of the time being arrested in Siberia when he got off his own personal jumbo jet. And this sent a message which at the time Bill Browder thought would be, crikey, Putin's one of the good guys. He's going to clamp down on the corrupt oligarchs. And they put this guy on trial. And Russian law being what it is, he ended up in a cage in a Moscow courtroom, which was televised all around the country. So this would be the richest man in Russia, ergo close to being the richest man in the world, on trial in a cage in Moscow. And guess what happened? All the other oligarchs rang up Vladimir Putin and said, what do we have to do to avoid the cage? And Vladimir Putin said to them, give me half. And that, my friends, is why the world is in the state that it's in. Pure and simple. Which brings us back to Brexit. If it did turn out that foreign money, Russian, had been spent illegally on persuading people to do something against the national interest, do you think the needle would move? Because I'm not a pessimistic person, as you know. I think one of the toughest lessons I've learned in recent years is that my faith in the fundamental decency of people is possibly often misplaced. But if it turned out that our democracy had been subverted by a foreign power, I don't think enough people would care. I don't think enough people in it. I mean, everyone who voted Remain is going to care, but that's as predictable as the sun coming up tomorrow. I don't think enough people that voted Leave would feel that they had voted Leave as a result of. Look, I wish this wasn't true. This isn't. It's one of those rare mornings where I'm not on my high horse telling everybody else what to think and what to do. This is me telling you what I think you think. I don't think there'd be enough people there, in my experience. And I don't mean the lunatic fringes of social media. I mean, like, decent, normal people who voted to Leave. Millions and millions of people who did it for all sorts of different reasons. I don't think anyone is going to admit that they were persuaded to vote the way that they did by illegal spending by a foreign power. I just don't think that we are psychologically ready to do that as a population, or half of the population, 52%, 51.9% of the electorate. I could be doing you a grave disservice. And that's my sad conclusion this morning, is that although this is a huge story and it involves a pretty grubby individual facing potential feeling of choler, but even if it turned out to be a huge crime committed against our democracy, the fact that people won't be prepared to acknowledge, accept, or admit that they made a mistake, or no one will say, I was conned. You leave the question hanging, of course, why would anyone spend millions of pounds doing something if it wasn't likely to affect things? But all of the people that voted to leave, I mean, that's really the invitation for the phone-in today. I genuinely don't want to have any arguments about Brexit. And because it's not really about facts today. It's about your feelings. And there's no way you're ever going to feel you were conned. Is there? 0345 60 973. I want to be wrong. And I know I'm not being very kind to you if you voted leave. You should really, really care if the Russians bought it. You really should care. I mean, think about us when we were growing up. Think about what the state of international politics was when we were growing up. You know, we were frightened of the Russians. Remember that Sting song, do you? It'd be such an ignorant thing to do if the Russians love their children too. Mr. Khrushchev says he'll bury you. That is the clear and present danger of a totalitarian regime with massive nuclear arsenal. But I don't think we will care enough. And I'm doing it again because I'm saying we. Really, I'm talking to a specific constituency of people who voted leave and would rather gloss over the fact that the Russian president might have bought Brexit for a ramshackle shower of self-serving, self-interested politicians and plutocrats in this country. You would rather carry on down this path than kick up the fuss that a story of this status and stature would ordinarily demand. Am I right? So ring me up and say yes, even if it turns out that the Russians bought Brexit, I still want to crack on with it because they didn't buy me. I'm doing it for the sovereignty and the passports. So 0345 60 60 973. I'm in it for the fish. I don't care if the Russians bought it. Or, by contrast, give me hope, Joanna, and call me to tell me that actually you did vote a certain way, but if it turns out that millions of pounds of illegal expenditure was invested in getting people to vote the way that you did, then you'd like to have another go, please, without the interference, allegedly, of Vladimir Putin. And that concludes this morning's sermon.
Now, the residents of the Isle of Man didn't get a vote in the 2016 European Union membership referendum, but their island is at the centre of a row over the funding of the Brexit campaign. The National Crime Agency is investigating Arron Banks, who helped fund the Leave.eu campaign, after the Electoral Commission said they suspect he is not the true source of £8 million of funding. The Electoral Commission suspects that some of the money may have been routed through a holding company on the Isle of Man, which would make it impermissible under UK electoral law. Our correspondent Claire Fallon joins us from Douglas on the Isle of Man. Claire.
Well, this small, blustery island is right in the middle of the Irish Sea, and it's also now right in the middle of the claims and counterclaims about exactly where millions of pounds that helped fund a string of pro-Brexit campaigns before the referendum actually came from. This place is not within the UK. So as you say, the people here didn't get a vote in the referendum. It is a Crown dependency. It's also officially not a tax haven. It is a low tax economy. But all the same, there are a lot of wealthy people who are registered as living here and a lot of wealthy people who have businesses here. And it is a business here in Douglas, not far from where we are, in an unassuming red brick building that has been highlighted by the Electoral Commission's investigation into all of this. The building itself, it's just the business itself, it's just one of the companies within that building. It's called Rock Holdings Limited. And according to the Electoral Commission, the majority shareholder is Arron Banks, the Brexit campaigner who funded much of the pro-Brexit campaigning before the referendum. The suspicion of the Electoral Commission is that the money didn't actually come from him, as he says it did. And the problem would be if it actually came through Rock Holdings Limited, because that is not a UK company, so it wouldn't be allowed within election law. The situation here, well, the Financial Services Authority on the island isn't saying a great deal, just saying that it's aware of the situation but can't discuss it. Meanwhile, there are also questions for Theresa May now, with claims that she denied a request from the security services back when she was Home Secretary to look into Arron Banks. Downing Street has said that they don't discuss details of conversations with the security services. Arron Banks himself has said that none of this is true. The allegations are false. He did nothing wrong. His companies did nothing wrong, that he didn't receive any funds from overseas, and that essentially the allegations are absolutely ludicrous. He says all of this amounts to mudslinging by the Remainers.
Thanks, Claire. Well, as just mentioned, it's been reported that Theresa May declined a request by one of the security services back in 2016 to investigate Arron Banks when she was Home Secretary. The Labour MP Ben Bradshaw has asked the Prime Minister if she or any other senior official stepped in to stop security services from investigating Mr Banks before the referendum. He joins me now from Exeter. Ben Bradshaw, you've been in the Cabinet. You know the government doesn't comment on the security services.
Well, the government usually doesn't comment on intelligence matters, but it simply won't wash for the government to hide behind that excuse on this issue. This isn't a traditional intelligence matter. This is a crime to subvert, or an alleged crime to subvert our democracy. So I'm afraid I will continue to ask the Prime Minister, as I expect will a fair number of parliamentarians in the days ahead, as to whether she did or did not block an investigation into Arron Banks more than 2 years ago. Because if she did, that is incredibly serious, because I have been asking questions about this now for more than 2 years in Parliament. I've simply been battered away by the Prime Minister and a whole succession of other ministers. And I think the British public deserve to know whether our democracy is being subverted, what happened in the referendum, and what the implications of that could be.
If she bats you away again, can anybody else find out? I mean, can any other committee of Parliament look into this?
Well, the Intelligence and Security Committee, as I understand it, is looking into all of this. The Culture, Media and Sports Committee have got the Electoral Commission and the National Crime Agency back in next week. So there are ample opportunities for us to continue to examine this. There are a number of excellent investigative journalists, including some of yours at Channel 4, still looking into this. And I understand that the report that the Daily Mail published today, that the Prime Minister blocked this, is extremely well and multiply sourced. So this is not going to go away, I'm afraid, until we know the truth about the referendum and what went on and where this money came from. We will not let this rest.
Brexiteers will say you're just trying to delay Brexit, aren't you, or overturn it, or run it all again.
There are plenty of other very good reasons for stopping the disaster of Brexit, but I've always been absolutely clear this is much more serious than this. This is about the integrity and the security of our democracy and our political system. And if we can't have confidence in that, I'm afraid whether you voted Leave or Remain, you should worry about it.
Ben Bradshaw, thank you very much for joining us.
Why would Theresa May turn down a request from the security services to investigate the finances of Arron Banks, who, of course, denies all wrongdoing, but is now the subject of a National Crime Agency investigation? Now, follow that question, and if you got to the end of that path, you'd find some fascinating facts, I think. But would they, and indeed if this investigation concludes in a way that would be very problematical for Mr Banks, I don't know whether the needle of public opinion would move, because it seems to me that if you voted to leave, you are never going to admit that it was because of Russian meddling and interference. And you will leave unanswered the question of why on earth anyone would spend millions of pounds doing something that had no effect on anyone. Get the numbers now, you will get through. Glenn's in Sudbury. Glenn, good morning. What would you like to say?
Good morning, James. The answers to your question are yes. I think the needle will move.
Do you?
I think the public. Well, yeah, only needs to move slightly, doesn't it? I don't
know if I agree with you. I think it needs to move like a. I've got to stop almost saying incredibly rude words on the radio, Glenn. You're a terrible influence on me. It needs to move like a mad thing, because you'd need to have routine and regular polling at least 60-40, ideally higher, before the pressure for another referendum became irresistible. If it moves at a tiny bit to, a stone cold 55-45, I don't think you're going to get the clamour for an informed referendum.
Well, okay. Well, let's just assume it does move to 60-40, like you've said. What do we do next then? I mean, if we have another referendum, how do we know that Russia's not involved in that?
Well, this is what I'm saying, and you rang up to contradict it. I'm saying even if it turns out that they were involved, people will still say, let's crack on with what we're doing. And you just did.
I'm not sure they will. Honestly, I'm not sure they will. I mean,
but you would want them to. You would want them to. You've rung in to say not everybody will be as stubborn and blinkered as me. I want to crack on with it, even if the Russians did do it, because, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm going to. You voted to leave the European Union, but you didn't do it for any of those reasons. You did it for your own reasons that have nothing to do with Russian interference, media manipulation, propaganda, or history, right?
No. I wasn't a fan of the European Union long before the advent of social media, which I think has been the main thrust of their activity.
That's what I just said.
I disagree. I mean, I voted to leave the European Union mainly for personal reasons. When the referendum came up a couple of years ago, 2 years prior to that, my income dropped by 20%.
This is what I'm saying. I'm saying that you will not. Your vote didn't have anything to do with Russian interference, so you would still want to crack on with Brexit, even if it turns out the Russians had paid for it.
No, I wouldn't.
So you'd want another referendum.
I wouldn't want another referendum.
There isn't a third choice, Glenn.
No. Well, listen, we wouldn't leave the European Union if that was the case. If that £9 million is found out to be moody, then we can't possibly leave the European Union.
And you would be comfortable with that?
No, I wouldn't. I'd still want to leave the European Union. I mean, I make the
hang on. So, are you describing? You're describing what would happen, what should happen, what would happen, and what could happen. So you would not change your view of the European Union because it's based on various things that we don't have the time to go into now. But you recognise that if our democracy had been subverted on that sort of scale, then the so-called will of the people ceases to exist.
No, the will of the people would be. I mean, it would be. Look, the referendum would be a non-event, wouldn't it?
I don't think it would.
$9 million.
But you're a witness for my case, and yet you're arguing with me because I'm saying people like you will still want to leave the European Union, even if it turns out that the money. That Brexit was moody. Brexit itself was moody, and you will still want to leave. And you're ringing me up to say that. We wouldn't leave, but that we should.
I would still want to leave the European Union.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
Yes.
But I would be happy that I would be in the minority.
Okay.
If that was the case.
Okay. So you are a fundamentally honourable believer in democracy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like it. And you just suck it up then?
Well, you'd have to go with a majority, wouldn't you?
But you can't have a majority unless you have another referendum. You're playing with my head, Glenn.
Well, I mean, that's a different question, James. What we do next is a different question. I mean, if this $9 million is moody, then I don't know where we go from there. But that certainly would make that referendum null and void, surely. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely I would agree with that. Absolutely I would agree with that. But I don't think many of your fellow Leave voters would agree with us. They would insist that it had nothing to do with why they cast their vote, and it's just the latest story dreamed up by the Ramonas to somehow try to subvert the will of the people. But the will of the people is not robust or reliable enough to countenance another referendum where the people would be asked what their will is. So if you had that much confidence in the will of the people, and this isn't addressed at you, Glenn, it's a cracking first call, you'd want referendums every week because you'd be dancing around with your mandate increased and your result enhanced and enforced and magnified every week. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's all going so brilliantly. Let's have another referendum. We can really rub it in those Ramonas' faces. Sherry's in Haringey. Sherry, what would you like to say?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I didn't take it lightly. I voted to leave, but I didn't take that decision lightly. I mean, I travel in and out of Europe. I'm in the music industry, and I know how
did you see
difficult all
the
of that can be.
evidence? Did you see the evidence to the Transport Select Committee about how concerts and promoters and bands moving in and out of Britain and
Oh, it's
Europe?
going to be horrendous.
But you voted for it.
But also, on the other hand, I work very closely with various communities up and down the country.
Yes.
In London as well as other, and you do see kind of sort of decimation of communities. You see the lack of jobs. You see unemployment.
Yes.
You know, and
So you voted for fewer. You voted for less jobs and less investment in the.
Well,
poorest
yeah, but
parts.
even the investment in somewhere or another possibly wasn't getting to where it needed to. I mean,
tell that to the people in Cornwall. Problem is, when it's the British government that gets to allocate all of this money, which will be a much smaller sum than is currently allocated, they're going to stick it in the constituencies that are most marginal for their own candidates. They're not going to do what the European Union does and just stick it in the poorest parts of the continent and
that might
United
be the case.
Kingdom. No, it is the case.
So, for example, I mean...
So, look, anyway, look, we're getting distracted. I'm going to be late for the news. If it turns out that the Russians bought Brexit, you'd still want to crack on, am I right?
Well, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
There you go. There's Sherry. And that is why, works in the music industry, going to be completely decimated by a no deal, completely overnight. 1st of April next year, it's all off. Seriously. It'll be almost impossible to go on tour. You certainly wouldn't be able to turn a profit. Secondly, she cares about all of the dispossessed and impoverished communities, which are all, according to every single impact assessment published by this government, they're all going to be worse off afterwards. And it looks possible now that the Russians might have bought the whole thing. But Sherry's cool. She still wants to do it. And that's why I am not as excited today as many so-called Ramonas apparently are. Obviously, I have to rely upon people who know more about specific issues than I do to inform, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're right. But my friend Sister Ray, to quote one well-known music DJ who works elsewhere, the butt-kicking new punk outfit, Sister Ray, who I bumped into in the studios in this building not long ago, been in touch to say it won't be impossible to go on tour. Actually, James, we're applying for Irish passports. Thanks, lad. On a serious note, there's a reason why bands get paid / treated better when playing in the EU. Those countries lobbied EU for subsidies and provides a interesting link to that as well. But hey, guys, you're doing details, evidence and facts. Haven't you caught up yet? 25 minutes to 11 is the time. Actually, quite encouraging response so far, suggesting that actually, however entrenched you may be in the belief that Brexit is a good idea, if it turns out that the referendum itself was corrupt, was subverted by foreign money, illegal foreign money, then you would, like Glenn. Glenn was great. A couple of you on Twitter suggesting he couldn't just bring himself, he was agreeing with what, we were agreeing with each other, but he couldn't bring himself to say the word second referendum. I don't like the word second referendum. I'm going for informed consent. I think if we're going to do Brexit, then I'd like to get informed consent from the country rather than just the kind of response that you get if you hit the right part of a knee with a little hammer. There it goes. Fish, passport, sovereignty, reflex. Informed consent would mean understanding stuff. I didn't understand enough to vote, and I don't think anyone did. 10:36 is the time. So if it turns out that the Russians bought Brexit, would you, as a Brexiter, be comfortable cracking on with it? Steve's in Plaistow. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Steve.
I've resisted the temptation to ring you on many occasions, but this one, I just felt I had to ring you.
It's because I'm like a siren. I'm like a siren.
Not at all.
Bringing you like I'm like a mermaid on the rocks, singing my siren song. Then finally today, your little rowing boat is pitched up on the bottom of my rock. Hello, Steve.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I'm going to contribute something to the conversation.
Of course, you already have.
Yeah. From my opinion, I mean, cards on table. I mean, I'm a Brexiteer. But I do believe you're right. I think that the Russians and others influenced the decision. Of course, it would be in their interest. And there is absolutely no doubt that they did that.
Sorry to interrupt you. Why would it be in their interest?
Well, pretty much along the lines of destabilising the West, really.
But you just said that you were on... Why would Brexit destabilise the West? And if it would, why would you be in favour of it?
Well... I'm trying to look at it from the Russians' point of view for a moment.
Okay.
I mean, any disruption within Europe would be in their favour. Any confusion, any disruption, I believe, would be in their favour.
And yet you voted for the most enormous, deliberate disruption imaginable, except war.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Yeah. And I wasn't really. I didn't ring up to discuss the reasons why I voted Brexit.
No, that's fine. Then we won't.
Pretty much,
I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to say you didn't vote for Brexit because you wanted to see the massive disruption to Europe that you realise it's going to bring about.
Well, no, I didn't. I didn't want to, but I did anyway, and that's cards on the table. But I think that the point I would like to make is that disruption from, in this particular case, from Russia. Yeah, I totally agree with. But I do think that as we move into a social media age. Then this is going to happen all of the time, and indeed it is. I mean, I don't...
Until the law catches up with the technology, you're absolutely right. But we have to have faith that it will, in the same way that the Wild West ceased to be wild when the agencies of law and order got the upper hand. But at the moment, you're right. I mean, it is going to happen again and again, and because it works. I mean, they saw Brexit and they thought, hey, White House next, comrade.
Yeah, but I think that this, even if you look at, many years back, I mean, if you go back to every election that happens, we always, I try to read the manifestos of every major party, but they're influencing us and they're lying to us because...
It's not a parallel, though, is it? A foreign regime seeking to destabilise our democracy in order to protect the illegal fortune of the Russian president. It's not really the same as Jeremy Corbyn promising to abolish tuition fees.
Well, the sentiment is the same, isn't it? I mean, if someone was going to try to influence me, I'd like them to influence me honestly.
Okay, I hear you, and we'll leave for the time being how you can be comfortable with the knowledge that you've contributed potentially to the biggest destabilising of Europe since the Second World War, and we'll focus instead on this question. If it's proved that the Russians bought Brexit, what do you want to happen next?
Well, unfortunately, and this is predictable, I guess, from my point of view, it wouldn't have altered, because I think the biggest threat is not the Russian influence in this particular case. Yeah. It's the failed European project. I know, James. But we all have opinions, and I'm partially agreeing with you. And I really wish it wasn't the same. I really wish it, we weren't getting influenced negatively, but we always will be.
Yeah, but not by a foreign leader who actively wants us to stumble and fall.
How do you know that there aren't many? Well, there are many other influences, positive and negative. We live in a global world.
You can't start doing that. You can't start saying, "Why are you investigating that murder? How there might be loads of murders that you haven't heard about."
But if you look at even the West, even America, they influence us one way and the other. Pretty much every major nation does around the world.
You're missing a massively important three-letter word.
What's that?
Law.
Law? What? Law. International law?
The law, our law, British law, electoral law. You can't compare a foreign politician expressing a preference for who wins the next British election or how a referendum turns out to a foreign demagogue and dictator spending millions and millions of pounds to encourage us to hurt ourselves. And you're not going to like this, Steve, and I hope you've enjoyed getting on the show, and I hope you'll ring in again. But you're proof that it worked. Food for thought. Richard is in Streatham. Richard, what would you like to say?
I'm in a position of going to agree with you totally and utterly about everything.
That's fine. You don't do whatever you do. Don't buy my book, mate. You don't need it.
Fair enough. No, I still think a new referendum is a must now, because if it's demonstrated that this illegal activity has been generated by Russia, all the words that you've already used, destabilising Europe, weakening Britain as a world power. We're pretty weak already. We're only big as part of Europe. We're only small now.
Unless, like Stephen, you somehow have this idea or opinion that the European Union is already failed, is already something that we... there's not a lot left, is there? But even then...
It hasn't failed at all, the European Union.
Well, I know that, and you know that, but we have to treat his opinion as the same as our knowledge.
Yeah, and I think it's still worthwhile having a referendum. I think you know this anyway, but there is an optimism here in that, because now the 16 to 18-year-olds who weren't able to vote 2 years ago will now have the vote. And I think they're going to be a lot more sensible than previous Leave voters. And they're going to vote to stay because they know their futures are wrapped up.
Are you Richard, who came in the other day?
I don't believe so, no.
Beth, you're making me look like a right amateur. We had a wonderful Welsh gentleman called Richard in the studio the other day who was sort of ex-special forces and a risk consultant, was talking about how he'd completely changed his mind. Richard Pendy.
All the time I missed that one.
Richard Pendy, his name was. Beth's just been a bit racist. She's basically saying that all Welshmen sound the same, Richard. Do you want to make a complaint?
No, all South Wales people do.
All Welshmen called Richard is her defence.
Yeah, all South Welsh people got similar accents.
Well, of course they do. I'm only teasing. Can I ask you the killer question?
Yeah.
How did you vote?
Remain.
Oh, all right. So yeah, you agreeing with me completely is not quite the breakthrough moment that it would have been if you'd voted Leave.
No. Unfortunately, I do know two people who voted Leave.
Yes.
One of them has actually changed their minds, but the other one is trenchantly stuck in this rut.
That is fascinating, because arguably I get unduly and disproportionately exposed to the more entrenched. Well, you use much more generous language than I do. I shall try and learn from your example and not say gammon, because you're describing people who are utterly immovable. Whatever changes, their position won't.
Yes.
And I wonder sometimes whether I overestimate how many of them there are, because so many of them dedicate so much of their time to trying to attract my attention on social media.
Well, one person's experience doesn't make fact, but I get embroiled in arguments with my email account, with the news items. I don't, is it okay to say the name of the email account?
I don't know. You've lost me a bit, but go on.
Yahoo, when you get the news items.
Yeah, of course.
And you get into conversations.
Yeah, the chat rooms and what have you.
It is remarkable that the Leave voters blame the EU for everything.
I know, and Lily Allen.
And so when the EU starts saying, well, you voted for borders, how are we going to sort the borders out? They blame the EU for imposing the borders that they themselves voted for.
It would be funny, wouldn't it, if it was someone else's country?
You get these ludicrous conversations, so you get people
Welcome to my world, Richard.
Yeah, you get people arguing as to why you shouldn't have a border with Ireland, but you voted for a border with Ireland.
They want to control our borders, but not our actual border. Oh,
that's right, you know.
Hey, fish though, Richard, fish.
Yeah, you have remarkably, and it gets quite vitriolic at times.
I love the way that I say this with a great deal of affection. I love the way you think you're telling me stuff I don't know. It's basically my life for the last 2.5 years that you've been describing, Richard.
Well, I have to say, one of my little statements was, when I voted Remain, I had a good idea that Europe was a great idea.
Yes.
And specific things I did know about. So, for example, one of the reasons I voted to Remain was I know that Europe is excellent at scientific research, and funding for it.
All right, here you go.
Notoriously bad at it.
Do you know what happened? Are you yanking my chain? Did you hear Sir Paul Nurse in this studio earlier this week? Was it earlier this week, or was it towards the end of last week?
I don't believe so.
Well, listen, I sat, because you talk about vitriolic arguments and people who think they know better and people who refuse to admit. I had Sir Paul Nurse, former head of the Royal Academy. He's won what's called a Nobel Prize for Science. He's been doing science for 50 years. He was on the screen over there in this studio telling me about how disastrous a no-deal Brexit would be, particularly for British science, and also how disastrous any sort of Brexit was likely to be. And guess what happened? People were queuing up to claim, Doris in Ongar and Dave in Braintree and Rupert in Chelsea, they were all queuing up to claim that they knew more about science than the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Sir Paul Nurse. Same thing happened yesterday, or 2 days ago, with Brian Cox. So you're not alone, Richard. You're not alone.
Not that I'm a scientist, but, you know, if I want to understand science, I'll go and read a science book. I'm not saying so if I want to know about astronomy, I'll read a Brian Cox book. If I want to know about something,
you're mad. Why wouldn't you just phone up Nadine Dorries and ask her about
I suppose I could do that.
Nuclear physics? She'll be clear on it, and if she doesn't know the answer, she can go and ask her mates on WhatsApp. I love that line. I can't believe we now live in a country where that is refreshing, to hear someone say, if I want to know about science, I'll read a science book. Richard, where have you been? If you want to know about science, get back on your Yahoo chat rooms and ask people who haven't been near a science book for 67 years. They're the people you should be trusting. And if your kids get sick, go and ask some far-right loony what treatment the child should receive. Do not, whatever you do, listen to the doctors at Great Ormond Street. I've really enjoyed this. I know we haven't taken loads and loads of calls because it's a subject that people need room to breathe and speak, but the idea that I think I've done you a disservice if you voted Leave. I've perhaps overestimated the number of people who don't care about the facts changing, to use that famous epithet wrongly attributed to John Maynard Keynes. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? It seems that the majority of our callers who voted to Leave, if the facts change so significantly that you could realistically conclude, or indeed legally conclude, that the Russians bought Brexit, then you would actually change your mind. Quite what would happen after that remains to be seen. Shamir Sani is in many ways the man who started some of these balls rolling. He is the Vote Leave whistleblower who, of course, not only lost his job, his livelihood, but also his privacy when 10 Downing Street elected, or a member of staff at 10 Downing Street elected, to announce to the world that he had previously been in a relationship with Shamir. Shamir hadn't actually told all of his family that he was gay, and that should have been a big alarm bell. And I sensed at the time, Shamir, that you couldn't quite believe it wasn't an alarm bell, the way you were treated.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. I think even for me, it wasn't more so about my trauma, but more so about how the country didn't see that as a immediate warning sign. And now, especially now that we know that Theresa May, before she triggers Article 50, knew that there could be potential criminal activity for the Vote Leave campaign and the Leave EU campaign. And now we know that she knew that she stopped an investigation into Arron Banks.
Or she declined a request.
She declined a request.
According to today's report.
Yeah.
We should stress that they are separate organisations, and the Vote Leave, the official campaign, was the one that you were working for, which has already been found to have been in breach of electoral law. I don't know, I mean, legally you'll have to be careful, but I know that you've been very across the requirements of this. How would you answer the question of why? Why would Theresa May turn down a request from the security services to investigate Arron Banks? Why would she allow a member of her staff to attempt to discredit your now validated complaints and revelations to the extent that he was able to throw your privacy under a bus and your sexuality into the public arena?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I don't think anyone. And I don't think Theresa May has willingly said, okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to not let them find out anything. But you have to take into account who is around Theresa May. Who are her senior advisors? Her top two senior advisors were the people that were part of the criminal activity that took part at Vote Leave during the Brexit campaign. She has, number 10, has invited Aggregate IQ, the Cambridge Analytica affiliated company, now banned in the UK and in Canada, into Downing Street.
So you think she's just not getting at the full picture because of the people that she is compelled to rely upon
Most
for information?
Definitely.
That's very generous of you.
No, I think Theresa May obviously is responsible and is complicit and is the person who should be held to account. Of course, and she should apologize and make a public statement. But it also needs to be taken into account that the entire system isn't just one person, that there's corrupt SPADs, there's corrupt advisors, there's corrupt cabinet ministers who all collectively are driving Britain into, well, a very bad hole.
Well, yes, corrupt is quite a big word to use because you don't necessarily mean that they are knowingly doing this. You could simply be suggesting that they are so entrenched in the ideological notion that the European Union is an enemy and that Britain can somehow regain 19th century status on the high seas that they are blind to all problems and evidence to the contrary.
Of course.
There's a sort of intellectual corruption rather than a legal or moral one.
Right. You could, yes, of course. You could. There's a variety of reasons why you would have, Britain would be in a situation where we have such, like it's insane that the Metropolitan Police delayed their investigation for 4 months. Why did they do that? It's ridiculous that
political sensitivities.
Well,
what does that mean?
How are we at a state in our country where the police are worried about political sensitivity.
Well, do you think? I mean, let's work it out together, because you're enmeshed and immersed in this story, and I've spent rather more time than is necessarily healthy covering it. So my answer to that question would be to say that something happened in the aftermath of the referendum that convinced Theresa May that whatever emerged, whatever changed, whatever evidence came to light, whatever whistles were blown by people like you, that the idea of stopping the train or changing tracks was simply beyond contemplation, and that would explain everything else that has followed. There was the lines that she used: Brexit means Brexit, utterly fatuous and meaningless, but a policy decision was taken when she got into Downing Street. Whatever happens, we're cracking on with this. And you would say, if I've understood you correctly, that was the result of influence being exerted on her, a Remainer, by some passionately pro-Leave people in her inner circles, both within Downing Street and the cabinet.
Well, that's politics, right?
Yes.
You become responsible. That's just politics. That's what politics is. You were advised and you make your own decisions, whatever. Obviously, she is responsible. However, I think what a lot of people sort of fail to realize is that the entire decision of Brexit and the Conservative Party's manifesto was based on the idea of it being the will of the people.
Yes.
And the will of the people relies on a democratic vote, a free and fair vote. Now, because Brexit was won by criminal activity, we know this. This is a fact. If anyone that denies that just hasn't looked at actual evidence.
But people will say, I don't care. I know why I voted. It has nothing to do with this criminal activity. And that's what I'm suggesting, that Theresa May has been keeping that constituency sweet because she has perhaps been misled over how big and how powerful that constituency is. I don't care if the Russians bought it. I don't care if Vote Leave... And, well, in fact, I don't care that Vote Leave broke electoral law. I don't care that young men like Shamir Sani have been treated appallingly by people in the Prime Minister's most intimate inner circle, because ideologically and emotionally I am so passionate to leave, although I can't tell you why, that I'll go bonkers if anybody tries to stop it. Yeah, that's who she's feeding, isn't it?
This is how dark politics has become in Britain. Yes. This is what I've consistently said on social media and publicly, that if you think Trump's America is bad, the UK is in a much worse position, particularly ideologically. So if we want to actually make any change, Theresa May is not going to change. She's there. She's responsible for what is going on. So the only way for us to actually have a proper look at this in depth and figure out what's wrong with Britain is through a public inquiry, which is being called by both a Conservative MP, Damien Collins, and a Labour MP, Tom Watson.
Leaving you in the spotlight today, do you think that there will be more revelations and allegations involving Vote Leave, your former employers?
I don't know about that, but I know that Nigel Farage could have a few answers regarding this whole debacle. But regarding Vote Leave, I think Leave You and Vote Leave had a few shared connections that need to be investigated. I can't really go into detail exactly.
Okay, no, and I wouldn't want you to.
Yeah.
I'm sure that Mr. Farage would deny any accusation or allegation that you made against him, just as Mr. Banks continues to do so, as the National Crime Agency beat a path to his door. Shamir Sani, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Look after. How are you doing anyway? Because I know you've been through the mill a bit. Are you in a better place?
Well, actually,
we're still on air.
I'm still on air.
Yeah. So I just realised you thought I'd say goodbye.
Yeah, no. Whoops. Okay, I was going to give you.
That's a good job I stepped in. But you're all right. Are you in a better place, or are you still feeling very, very battered?
I think, and I'm pretty open about this.
I know.
The experience that I had was extremely traumatic. I've said this again and again, but because I was very much in the cycle of it, it's only now that it's actually all hit me.
Yes, that's what I feared.
And so I have a good circle of friends, and my family is
good.
Incredible. So I just need to find a job. So if anyone wants to hire a social media
a top of the range digital content strategist, you can find Shamir in all the usual social media places.
Most definitely. So just really the job hunt, and then
because this is what is easy to overlook, is that you had a dream job.
They screwed me over.
You thought you had a dream job, and suddenly you had nothing.
Well, I was on a trajectory, right? I was on a very fast trajectory, and I was surpassing a lot of people that were literally twice my age.
Sure.
And I was in a comfortable position. Yes, ideologically, I wasn't matching with the people around me, but in my career, I was doing well.
Yes.
Because what I do is digital strategy, right? So to then have that entire, not just my personal life be like obliterated, but also my career be put on hold, to have to pivot has been difficult. But I always say to myself, like literally every night I go to sleep, I'm like, I did it because because things like democracy and protecting the general population, the community, is more important than my own individual traumas.
Oh, you're too modest to say so, but you did it because principle and integrity are more important to you than self-advancement and vanity, which makes you both morally, politically and personally the polar opposite of the person you mentioned earlier. It's 2 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
Around this time yesterday, the news had just broken that the Electoral Commission had referred Mr. Banks to the NCA, the National Crime Agency, who themselves have launched an investigation into what they describe as multiple suspected offences, including an alleged conspiracy to conceal the true details of financial transactions. The Electoral Commission suspects, that's where we are at the moment, suspects that money Mr. Banks gave and loaned to the Leave.eu campaign, that he was not the true source of those loans to the campaign, and that the money had come from what the Electoral Commission describes as impermissible sources. Possibly foreign, who knows? We don't know yet. What I want to know from you, after a short discussion here with a couple of people, what I want to know from you is, do you want to know? This is such a pivotal vote in our history, the Brexit referendum. Do you want to know if illegalities took place? If, we don't know. But do you want to know, even if it were to pause Brexit, even if it were to lead to a second vote of some sort? 0345 6060 973, the number to call. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. Damien Collins joins me, Chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, Conservative MP for Folkestone and Hythe. And we'll hear as well from Peter Jukes, the author and journalist and director of Byline, who worked very closely with the Guardian journalist Carol Cadwallader on uncovering this and aspects of other related stories on Brexit as well. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon.
Damien Collins, first of all, you were of the view, after extensively questioning Arron Banks and Andy Wigmore, that Mr. Banks still had questions to answer about a particular source and flow of money. Can you remind us what that was?
Yes, well, we said in our report that Arron Banks had donated over £8 million to the referendum campaign through Leave.eu, and we weren't satisfied from the answers he gave as to what the source of that money was. In the past, it had been suggested that the money had come from the sale of a business, but it turns out he didn't make very much money from the sale of that business. He has other business interests, which again don't appear to make very much money. And so we said that if the Electoral Commission couldn't be absolutely clear in their own mind where this money had come from, then they should refer this to the National Crime Agency for a full investigation. And that's what's happened. But actually, the Electoral Commission is saying a lot more than just, we're not sure where the money's come from. They're being really specific. They're saying, in their view, the money, as you said, didn't entirely come from Arron Banks, and they've named a business in the Isle of Man, which they do believe some of the money came from, and they're saying that wouldn't have been permissible. And the Times is reporting today as well that this information, some of this information and some of the leads they've got have come from people that work for Arron Banks. So I think we've got to take this incredibly seriously. And the fact the National Crime Agency have been brought in shows how seriously it's being taken. This is unprecedented. This has never happened before in British politics for the NCA to get involved. And I think the significance of them getting involved is they have extra jurisdictional powers, to see bank records, financial records, statements, documents outside of the UK. And I think obviously in this case that's going to be very important as part of the investigation.
And Peter Jukes, what was your first thought as somebody who's looked into not just this but into Cambridge Analytica, into many aspects of the Trump campaign as well, and the Russian use of social media? What was your first thought when you heard this, that the National Crime Agency was to be involved?
Well, thank goodness, really. I mean, this isn't about Leave or Remain. It's about Conservative, Labour or Lib Dem. It's about the rule of law, and one of the cornerstones of our rule of law is that democracy is protected against foreign influence and overspending. And, Arron Banks tries to politicise this, it's a bunch of Ramonas. But the thing is, how can we trust future elections? Who's spending what? Who's targeting us with dark ads, unless the very important work that Damien is doing is secured and that we know who we're electing and who's paying them. Because, all future elections are at risk. So it really shouldn't be too politicised around parties or around the EU referendum. If Remain had spent the same amount of money for foreign agencies or foreign sources, I'd be just as outraged. And it's very important to protect our democracy.
When it comes to the implications of this, clearly we have to give the NCA time to do its investigations. Arron Banks himself is going to appear on the BBC tomorrow to talk about all of this or aspects of it. Where does it leave Britain and Brexit if illegalities are found, Damien Collins?
Well, I think I agree with what Peter Duke said. There are two things here. It's a matter for the police, the NCA and the courts to investigate offences and charge people if they've committed offences, and they should face whatever the sanction of the law is. Now, it's not a matter for the police and the courts to determine what should happen about Brexit. That ultimately is a matter for the British people and for Parliament.
Well, let me change the question. Would it have implications for what happens on Brexit?
Well, as I said, I think that ultimately will be a matter for Parliament and the people to decide once these investigations have drawn to their conclusion. I think we couldn't speculate that at the moment. And I equally think it's wrong to try and conflate the two. And that's what Arron Banks tries to do. It's almost like saying, if you think he should be investigated, your motivation is to stop Brexit, rather than just feeling Arron Banks should be investigated because these are serious charges. And I don't think we should conflate the two at the moment. And I think if in time it turned out there was widespread wrongdoing and that was proven in a court of law, well, I mean, that would be a different matter, but I don't think we should, preempt that.
Oh, you surprised me with your response there, because he, right off the bat yesterday in his statement, said this is anti-Brexit campaigners pushing for a criminal investigation. Peter Dukes.
My thing is the truth. We need the truth to come out. I mean, there is a time scale. I do think slightly different. Damien, I'm not a politician. I think we have to be so careful that if Brexit is going ahead on the basis of flouting of electoral law and foreign interference, that should be questioned. But the other element we've got to look here is the extensive connections between Leave EU and the Trump campaign. And I think we'll get even more progress on that from America, because remember, there's an FBI inquiry into Russian influence in the US elections. And those people who've looked at it, it's very difficult to separate the two campaigns. Putin desperately wants to break up the West and the EU, confound allies like Britain and the US. And there is a political urgency over that because, we have world politics at stake. And, we just have to, this is the enlightened rule, we follow the evidence. And if the public decide Brexit is too dangerous, too risky, too expensive, and on the basis of maybe false information and propaganda and false spending, well, that's political. That's up to the public. They can take the information from wherever they go. Like Damien, I don't think they should be conflated, but people will come to conclusions from the evidence that's amassing.
But isn't that a bit like saying, my husband is under investigation for stealing our life savings, and and if it's found out to be true, only then will I make a decision as to whether I stay with him or not. Do you see what I mean? There's like they are intrinsically conflated, are they not, Damien Collins?
But in the public's mind, I think Damien's making the point, and I would make the point as journalists that it's journalists and politicians should investigate, and the public should make its own mind.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Because I think what people like Arron Banks want to say is, well, you're only doing this because I'm a Brexiteer and you voted Remain in the referendum, and therefore there's no public interest in your investigation, and that's just rubbish. I mean, there is a massive public interest in understanding how money is raised for elections, how it's spent, and on some of these other wider issues as well about the extent of Russian interference in public life, Russian contact with public figures, disinformation and fake news. These are about not only investigating things that may have gone wrong in the past, but also putting in place the rules to protect our democracy in the future. And that's about more than Brexit. That's about all elections. So that's why it's so important we pursue this. Now, if as a consequence of these investigations, it is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was serious issues in the way the referendum was fought and conducted, then I think the public need to come to a view on that at that point. But
what if we've left by then?
Well, I mean, we can ultimately, we're a sovereign country. We can take a position on any issue at any time, but I don't think it is right to say that somehow this is all about trying to stop Brexit. It's not. It's about saying, well, if there was wrongdoing, it should be investigated. If people are proven to have done wrong, they should face the consequences of that.
And if there are broader implications, then we need to consider those at that time.
Because Arron Banks has, since your questioning of him, your committee's questioning of him, has come after you very personally, hasn't he? He's sent letters to your constituents, essentially defaming you, it seems to me. Your response to that has been just to stand firm and just do your job as you would always do it, presumably. Yeah, that's your tack here, is it? It's just...
Well, I've wrote in the Guardian this week about that, saying that I'm not going to be bullied and intimidated by someone like Arron Banks. And my view is if he's going to go to all that trouble of spending £38,000 writing to everyone in my constituency, well, then, that's not going to stop me doing my job. And actually, I'm having folks do it at the moment. The reaction from local people to his rather crude and nasty letter is one of anger. They don't like being told what to do by someone like Arron Banks, and they'll make their own mind up about me, and that's what democracy is all about. And I think this is a kind of, Arron Banks is a pattern of behaviour of trying to intimidate journalists, intimidate politicians, trying to throw people off the scent of his work, and he doesn't like people standing up to him, and that's why he took such huge exception to being questioned in front of the Select Committee. And for me, that just underlines why it's so important we do what we do.
OK, thank you very much indeed to both of you, to Damien Collins, Chair of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, Conservative MP for Folkestone and Hythe. Be good to hear from a constituent if you got one of those letters from Arron Banks. Peter Jukes, thank you to you, author, journalist and director of Byline. Didn't come back to you, Peter, because it was quite noisy in the background. No more, no less than that. Thank you very much for your time. Peter Jukes and Damien Collins. Over to you now. It's interesting that both men, particularly Damien Collins, feeling very strict lines have to be drawn between this investigation, even if it turns out that illegalities happened in the Leave.eu finances, in the Leave.eu campaign, that it shouldn't at this stage be conflated with Brexit. Is that even possible? 0345 606 0973, the number to call. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. Do you regard this as important as Damien Collins and Peter Jukes do? Are you glad that the Leave.eu finances, Arron Banks' finances, are being investigated, even if it were to press pause down the line on Brexit or undo Brexit? They weren't prepared to make the link, but I am. 0345 606 0973. Arron Banks under investigation now, not just by the Electoral Commission, but by the National Crime Agency. He says he's glad of it. He thinks it will put to bed for once and for all any notion that he was underhand in any way financially in the support he gave to the Leave.eu campaign. Tony's called from Chichester. Are you glad he's being investigated criminally, Tony?
I mean, yes, if there's some sort of, if he's done something wrong, then there should be some sort of investigation, obviously, to make sure it doesn't happen again. But it shouldn't affect Brexit at all, because if you look at overall spending, the Remain campaign spent a lot more than the Leave campaign, including the government's propaganda that came through everybody's door. So there's an imbalance from that point of view, and people still voted to leave. So it shouldn't affect Brexit at all.
Isn't the problem, though, that it just could affect Brexit? If the scale of how is a tough one to measure, I'll grant you that. But if one of the fundamental aspects of the campaign was funded by foreign money, and let's say it, Russian money potentially, and this could all be pie in the sky, that's why an investigation has to take place. But if it isn't, and we hear yesterday that that Russian internet bots and social media bots are ploughing disinformation out there for people to be affected by, we need to address that, don't we, Tony? We need to, at the very least, educate ourselves about it.
But there's been conversation about misrepresentation all along from both sides anyway.
What do you mean misrepresentation?
Well, everyone from both sides, when they were doing like the government's propaganda, there was misrepresentation there. George Osborne saying about, there'd have to be an emergency budget, interest rates would go up. All this representation.
No, but that's not illegal. That's campaigning. That's not George Osborne saying, "Hey, Russia, give me 20 billion and I'll say this."
No, but it's still all misrepresentation. You can go around in circles all the time. I think everybody who voted to leave, or the vast majority, knew what they were voting for. I knew what I was voting for. It said, "Do you want to leave the European Union?" Yes. Lock, stock and smoking barrel.
And if illegality is found here, then what?
well, then the person obviously has to be go to court and have his day in court. But I don't think it should affect Brexit. I can't understand why it would affect Brexit.
If £8 million was swishing around the Leave campaign, and the Leave campaign won, and the £8 million was illegal, lots of ifs here. But if you think that doesn't affect that doesn't affect the view of the outcome?
No, I don't. Not at all.
Why not? Why not?
Because as I said, there was lots of misrepresentation anyway.
No, it's not. You're conflating two very different things. If I'm in a competition with you, and there are strict limits on how much we can spend and what type of money we can spend, and I illegally break those rules, and I win, you'd want to recount. You'd want a rehash of that, wouldn't you, Tony?
I think that's sort of it's just making a different scenario. The whole.
No, that's the exact scenario here. You have 8 million I don't have, or I have 8 million you don't have. I use that 8 million to win, or you use that 8 million to win.
But that's the one against one.
Well, it's group against group. It's found to be.
But it's not because
it's found to be illegal. I think you'd be calling for a recount, wouldn't you, or a rerun?
You're looking at one. As I said, if that's one against one, which would be totally unfair. But as the Leave campaign spent a lot more in their propaganda, I don't see
but 8 million goes a long way in a campaign.
It's going to make any difference.
Well, 8 million goes a long way in a campaign, whether it's one group against another or one individual against another.
They still spent less than the Remain.
Legally.
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree, but can you see the point I'm making, though?
I can, but I think we are going to have to agree to disagree, because I think it does have bearing if it turns out to be the case. I mean, we have no idea that it's the case. Arron Banks, whatever you think of him, deserves a fair investigation by the National Crime Agency. Thanks, Tony, and another Tony in Windsor. Hi.
Yeah, hi. I think we've gone past the point of no return in relation to a second referendum, right? If everyone's sort of hopes are that the NCA might be able to come up with something, on that basis, that could take maybe years, 6 months, 2 years, whatever.
Well, it's not that we want them to come up with something. But, it still needs to be a proper and fair investigation, whoever it's about.
Yeah, no, I haven't got a problem.
It's the implications of what they find that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I voted to leave, but I thought the Leave campaign in general was terrible, and I thought that it's so awful that Remain would romp home. I'm not really a fan of Arron Banks, and the Leave campaign was a totally awful campaign, and the fact that they won in the end. Also,
in what way awful? What's that with you?
I just thought it was quite amateur, and they didn't even have a plan of getting us out of the EU, and that's why we are where we are. A fail to plan is a plan. No plan to get us out in general. It was just sort of lots of phrases and random noises.
To be fair, the other side weren't much better, were they? And George Osborne seemed to concede that this week, that Remain made some mistakes too.
But if they do a proper investigation, which they're obviously going to, they need to obviously also see whether this so-called 8 million, how it actually influenced people. And what makes me laugh is that people think this is going to be the silver bullet to, get us back in the EU. But if you look about generally, there was a big rump of about 30 to 35% of the population that was always going to vote to leave the EU anyway. And that was backed up by the fact that UKIP used to romp home in virtually every Euro election that I can remember. So the fact of the matter is, I think you're giving too much credit to the likes of...
No, I mean, I'm not suggesting that this in and of itself can undo or should undo the Brexit vote, not for a second. Because even if it were found to be the case that this 8 million had been spent illegally and used illegally, you'd still have to have a proper assessment of its impact on that campaign.
Yeah, I think it was, I'd say it was minimal, because there's as I said to you before, the polls after poll for the Euro elections, every time we've had them for the last 2 or 3, going back 12, 15 years, UKIP has romped home every time. All right, the turnout wasn't massive, but there was still...
Yeah, but they never got elected here, did they? Douglas Carswell, when he was a UKIP MP, was already in Parliament and crossed the floor.
The point I'm trying to make is that, Arron Banks, he's a genius. He's actually manipulated everyone. Whereas the UK was pretty much Eurosceptic, and when it came to immigration, people wanted there was overwhelming support, poll after poll, for controls in immigration. I think you're giving too much credit to somebody nobody had ever even heard of before he donated £1 million to UKIP many moons ago. I mean, their campaign was utterly pathetic.
And then 8 million to leave.eu. Generous. Tony, thank you. Ruth in West Hampstead, hello.
Yeah, hi, Sheila. I have to hold my hands up that I am a Remainer, so I'll get that out there to begin with. Okay. But I think this is, if not treasonous, I think it's borderline treasonous. And of course it absolutely has to be treated in the most serious fashion. It's just ridiculous. I mean, if this people talk about, the spending of the Remain campaign. Well, that was a government leaflet put out there to inform the electorate, which is entirely different.
Well, it's interesting, the statement from the Electoral Commission on why they sent it for criminal investigation is interesting, and it kind of points in the direction of what you're saying. Not treason. I literally never understand when something is treasonous or not these days. It seems to change with the wind. While electoral law offences, this is from the NCA, from the Electoral Commission, while electoral law offences would not routinely fall within the NCA's remit, the National Crime Agency's remit, the nature of the necessary inquiries, in this case, the Banks case, and the potential for offences to have been committed other than those under electoral law, lead us to consider an NCA investigation appropriate in this instance. So there is clearly a suspicion that offences that could have been committed were of a deeply serious, of a criminal and a serious nature, rather than just playing fast and loose with electoral spending. So that's why.
And if it's the case that Russia is behind it, and Putin is trying to change democracies around the globe to his own benefit. Absolutely, we have to be on top of this. Whether you're a Leaver or a Remainer, I mean, I don't see that there is a difference.
Well, I would have thought
the Leave side certainly would be shouting if they had, the referendum had not gone their way. Absolutely, they would have wanted this looked at. You cannot be so binary that you'd be prepared to have a foreign power influence something that changes the course for decades of this country. It's just outrageous.
Well, that's what I think. And if that foreign power turns out to, if there is such a thing, if it turns out to have been Russia, I mean, that's explosive stuff. £8 million
Exactly.
of Russian money potentially in a UK election, whatever the election.
Exactly. I think it's totally explosive. Do I think it will change the outcome of the referendum? It's impossible to say, because there have been so many twists and turns and so many things that we think, people will think differently about this. They'll think differently about Boris Johnson after comment.
Well, it's too late now. We've got the date.
Nothing changes. So I don't know. I don't know what will happen.
But you feel if foreign money was involved, things should change.
Absolutely.
OK, Ruth, thank you. Ruth in West Hampstead. More of your calls in a few minutes, and we'll have more as well from Theo Usherwood on that Met investigation into anti-Semitism in Labour. Stay with LBC. Right, before I get back to your calls on the implications of this National Crime Agency investigation into Arron Banks and Leave.eu financing, you will know if you've been listening to LBC this morning that police have launched a criminal inquiry into allegations of anti-Semitic hate within the Labour Party, crimes within the Labour Party. This is off the back of Theo Usherwood obtaining an internal Labour dossier detailing 45 cases involving messages posted by party members on social media. Theo's here, LBC's political editor, to tell us more. Take us back to the beginning of this for people who might not remember how it began.
So, if you think you see an anti-Semitic hate crime or an anti-Semitic incident being committed by a Labour Party member, and you take it to the press and it appears on a blog or in a newspaper, then as a result, the Labour Party press office will get a call and they would investigate it. And then they would go to the compliance unit within the Labour Party, who would carry out a further proper investigation where they would go to the individual involved who alleged to have made a complaint, and they would ask them they'd give them a right of reply. They'd make a decision on whether they should be suspended from the party or issued with a notification of an investigation. Now, and the next stage is the most important stage. If at the next stage there is a decision that this should warrant disciplinary process, it goes to the disputes panel of the National Executive Committee. And we obtained a dossier sent to that disputes panel on the 3rd of July, and it was discussed on the 3rd of July with recommendations about how each case should be treated.
Listing people who were subject to those kinds of allegations.
Listing exactly what the allegations were, from serving Labour councillor who was accused of inflicting 10 years of hell on a child, calling him a Jew boy. Another 2 MPs were threatened with being thrown off the top of a building. Another Jewish woman, Labour MP, was told she was going to get a good kicking in a Facebook message. And then they make a decision, they make a recommendation. Now, we don't know where those landed as a result of the recommendations. They recommend those vary from the National Constitutional Committee being involved, and that's the only body within the Labour Party that has the right to boot somebody out, to somebody being given training after they've apologised. That's the range, if you like,
of what can happen.
Now, we obtained a dossier containing, with all of the details that I've just described, of 60 cases of where the disputes panel had been called in, and
we had it reviewed.
We had 45 of those related to anti-Semitism, we found from looking at it. We then had that reviewed by a man called Mac Chishti, who, until 2016, was the Metropolitan Police's most senior Muslim police officer. And he also ran the hate crime unit within the Metropolitan Police. Absolute expert, unimpeachable expert in this area. And he reviewed it with his team. And he came to the conclusion that 17 of those 45 incidents warranted investigation as hate crime incidents, where they could be investigated just as incidents recorded, but there may be the need to step it up to a criminal investigation. But 4 of the 45, beyond the 17 that I've discussed, actually warranted, in his view, past the threshold for a police criminal investigation. Now, as a result, we passed the document to Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, and this is what she said.
If somebody makes an allegation to us which contains something like that, absolutely we will take it seriously, we will scope it, we will see whether a crime has taken place. First instance, does it look like a crime, which is perhaps what Mac has done, I don't know. I, of course, will pass this to my experts to deal with. The law is quite complicated, the bar is actually quite high. It's not, just because I'm offended or you're insulted, it's got to be threatening. It's got to incite racial... There's a number of different offences, but they are quite a high bar because freedom of speech is highly valued in this country. But absolutely, if somebody makes an allegation, Gideon, hands us a dossier, we'll look at it, we'll scope it, we'll see if a crime's been committed.
The Gideon referred to by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner was Gideon Falter, the chairman of Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. What the Met Commissioner was saying there is, at that present time, this was back in September, she's going to ask some specialist officers to look at the cases and to see whether it warranted criminal investigation. Now the Met Police gave us a statement, we've got an exclusive on LBC, where they said the contents have been examined by specialist officers. A criminal investigation has commenced into some of the allegations within the documentation. Early investigative advice is being sought from the Crown Prosecution Service. Just after we broke the story, Cressida Dick was appearing on the BBC's Radio 4 Today programme.
If somebody passes us material which they say amounts to a crime, we have a duty to look at that and not just dismiss it. And we have been assessing some material which was passed, in fact, to me in a radio studio, of all things, about 2 months ago. And we are now investigating some of that material because it appears there may have been crime committed, and we are liaising immediately with the Crown Prosecution Service, and I hope we'll be able to clear that up very quickly.
And what? Now, Sadiq Khan is the effective Police and Crime Commissioner for London as the Mayor of London. We caught up with him this morning and asked him what was being done.
The Labour Party has not been investigated, but individuals who may be members of the party are being investigated. I've been quite clear. Anti-Semitism is racism. There should be no place for anti-Semitism in our society, let alone in the Labour Party. The Labour Party at its core, is a party that's anti-racist, that doesn't simply reflect our society but seeks to shape it for the better. And we've got to have a zero-tolerance policy towards anybody who holds these views. Anybody with these views should be kicked out of our party. Anybody who has these views should know this party is not home for you.
Sadiq Khan speaking there. The question is, would Labour have passed these cases on to the police? What we do know...
Or even been equipped to. I mean, you would hope that the NEC's committee on this would be equipped to spot one that was potentially a criminal, requiring a criminal investigation. But it's a question that isn't answered yet.
No, and... in their statement, and I should read it to you because it's critical to this, a spokesperson for the Labour Party said the Labour Party has a robust system for investigating complaints of alleged breaches of Labour Party rules by its members. Where someone feels they've been a victim of a crime, they should report it to the police in the usual way. But what we discovered, Sheila, when we went to each of the 10 MPs who were victims and named as victims within these cases, within this document, none of them had been contacted to say that they had been victims of crimes. So they didn't know that these cases...
Within their party.
Within their party. So unless their staff or they or somebody they knew had reported the case and told them about the case, they didn't know that it existed. Now, some of these MPs require police protection. Not round-the-clock police protection. They don't necessarily have a guard with them.
And threats had been made or things had been said that were of a particular nature, and they didn't know.
From speaking to the MPs who've been involved with this, there's a huge amount of anger as why weren't we told? Why weren't we told that these cases existed? So we could update our security, so we could go and speak to our police protection officers and say that these cases exist.
You need to know the nature of the threat against you to protect yourself from the threat against you. Interesting. Well, let's see how it develops. Thank you very much, Theo Usherwood, LBC's political editor. This text from Steve on the subject in hand, Arron Banks and the investigation by the National Crime Agency, I should say, into his financing of Leave.eu or aspects of it. Steve says, I don't understand how money can influence people's votes. If someone asks me a question, I will have an instant opinion on it based on my gut feeling. I would not change my opinion however much money was spent on ads, says Steve. Good for you. Not true of everyone. You're listening to Shelagh Fogarty on LBC. Keep your calls coming on whether you are as glad as Arron Banks says he is about this National Crime Agency investigation into his finances, into this Isle of Man business, this account on the Isle of Man that seems to have funded to the tune of 8 million the Leave.eu campaign. Damien Collins, the MP who is chair of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, was on this programme just half an hour or more ago, says that Arron Banks still has some very serious questions to answer. It looks as though the Electoral Commission agrees with him. More of your calls on this in a minute. Let's just bring ourselves up to speed on this story involving Sony Music HQ in West London. 2 people have been stabbed there this lunchtime. Scotland Yard says one person has been arrested and it's not being treated in any way as terror-related. Matthew Thompson, LBC senior reporter, is at the scene. Matthew, what do you know?
Good afternoon, Sheila. Well, yes, just in the last few minutes, some clarity. There had been rumours swirling most of the afternoon that I've been here that actually what had gone on was some sort of altercation between staff members, possibly in the kitchen. And just in the last few minutes, Sheila, we've had that confirmed in a statement from Sony, who say that, yes, indeed, what did happen was that there was an altercation between 2 members of catering staff. Clearly, catering staff are operating in an environment where there are lots of knives and sharp objects, and clearly an argument has escalated of some description. So perhaps the worst fears that this might have been some sort of terrorist incident. Anytime armed police are scrambled to a building in the United Kingdom at the moment, that's always what we jump to first, isn't it? The worst fears not in this case realised. But police have said, as you mentioned in your introduction, 1 man was arrested, 2 have been taken to hospital. Injuries, however, not thought to be life-threatening. Footage posted on social media showed 1 man being taken out on a stretcher, although he was conscious, and then another man being led away in handcuffs. And I've spoken to several people this afternoon who reported hearing a commotion, possibly on the 4th floor of the building. Fire alarms were activated and staff were evacuated and people ran outside screaming. Several people standing outside this afternoon that I spoke to were visibly shaken. but most of them have either gone home or gone back into work. The building now fully operational again. And as I say, the worst fears, I suppose, in this instance, not realised.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Matthew Thompson, LBC senior reporter at the scene there in West London, Sony Music HQ. Now, you've been sending me directly to my Twitter feed, at Shelagh Fogarty, some interesting tweets on this Arron Banks story that we're discussing, and the £8 million in donations and loans to the Leave.eu campaign that's currently being investigated by the National Crime Agency. Jack says, to suggest that people were influenced by the Leave campaign only is a joke. I voted Leave based on the £9 million booklet by the government not being consulted on the Maastricht Treaty and governments giving away my country. Chris Morgan on Twitter echoes that in a way, says, so if I have 8 million you don't have, I have an unfair advantage. May I ask about the £9 million of our cash Cameron spent on the Remain pamphlet and when that'll be investigated? And I've already responded to Chris, saying to him, you make a good point, sort of. And I said sort of because the £9 million booklet, which I don't know about you, but I skim-read and then threw in the bin, was indeed, well, it was two things. It was legal. It was outside of the sort of restricted spending period of an election. And it was also legal. It was legal. I think it was a shabby tactic, but it was legal. What's being investigated here is potential illegality. That's the difference. Christine in Windsor, hello.
Hello, Sheila. Yes, I've been listening to your programme and Mr. O'Brien all morning, and I just can't believe that the leaders just don't get it, that this was an illegal act.
You know, potentially, he's only being investigated.
If it comes out, they've been investigated, yes. But if it is, but what upsets me so much that it's been the process of democracy has been perverted, to win, to get an unfair advantage over the country, and it's nothing to do with parties, Leavers and Remainers. It's our country, our sovereign country, that a foreign power can actually pay somebody in our country to pervert the course of justice.
Yeah, I mean, if I found out that
it's treasonable.
If I found out that a huge donation to the Remain campaign from Trump or Putin or I don't know whoever else, external power, had potentially influenced a Remain win, I wouldn't be happy with that.
No, nor would I.
And it would be illegal.
It is illegal, and it's not fair. And it's wrong in a country as fair as ours, We always have processes in place, and I don't know how this wasn't sort of flagged up earlier on or questioned earlier on.
I don't think this country is as fair as we like to say we are. We have some extraordinary institutions that allow for fairness, and thank goodness for them. But I think we could definitely do better. Christine, thank you. Christine in Windsor. Maverick on Twitter says, if another country influenced the UK referendum, then who is getting whose country back? And Mark says, so people just spent $9 million for no impact on the result. Feels like an awful way to waste some money in that case. Jason in Wimbledon, hello.
Good afternoon, Sheila. Sheila, about 18 months ago, I phoned in and I talked to you, and I don't know if you remember, but I said that you reminded, and I meant it in a nice way, you reminded me of the knight in the Monty Python films, the one who gets all his limbs cut off and he still fights.
Yeah,
and here you are.
I remember. Of course I remember.
Sheila, I just think it's really, really unfair, because one thing, I listen to LBC a lot, and one thing I've learned, and I do act upon it, is that you can't blame everybody for one person's actions. Now, I never knew who Arron Banks was until a couple of weeks ago. I understand what you're saying about the legality of it, but should all them 17.5 million people really be punished? Because even if this man, I know it's an if, even if this man was found out to have done things illegal, do you think that 17.5 million people should be punished for that?
No, I don't. And I don't regard it as a punishment to make sure that our electoral system is a clean one. That's perhaps where that's perhaps where I would lose another limb at this point, Jason.
The
Black Knight.
Yeah, that's fair. It's just a little bit like, to me, it's getting a little bit. I know this is a big thing, but it's getting a little bit like the boy who cried wolf, because anything to do with Brexit now. Anyone who voted Brexit seems to have this about and bad, or this about and bad. Most of the people.
I don't say that. You know, I don't say that, Jason.
I know you don't. But you know, I'm talking about as a whole. That's how I really, really will be pleased when it's over now.
Well, according to Dominic Raab, November the 21st will be the initial deal that we'll have.
I will not hold my breath.
Yeah. We'll see. Jason, thank you again for your call. Thank you. I'm going to look up that bit. Which Monty Python film was it in when Black Knight got his arms and legs and everything else chopped off? I can't remember the actual film it was in. I will find out. Anthony in Chingford, hello.
Hi, hello Sheila. Thanks for taking my call.
Pleasure.
I can't help feeling uncomfortable because I am a Leaver, but thinking that Nigel Farage was in bed with someone who is closely involved or related with Russia, and to think that
these are allegations.
Taken influence from that, I can't help but feel he should be involved if there's any fallout and investigated with the knowledge that he might have had of that. I feel very uncomfortable about it.
Well, are you a fan of Nigel Farage? Is that why you feel uncomfortable about it?
Yeah, I have been a great fan of his. Yeah, of course.
And a regular listener to his programme?
Yes.
Well, then, I mean, I have no idea whether he is in their purview or not. But I do know
Nor do I.
No, I don't. But I do know that I do know that the investigation. According to the National Crime Agency, this is their statement, we've initiated an investigation concerning entities Better for the Country and Leave.eu, as well as Arron Banks, Elizabeth Bilney and other individuals. Beyond that, I know no more, Anthony.
Nor do any of us, I'm sure, but it just made me feel uncomfortable. I just thought I'd put my point forward.
But elaborate on why it makes you feel uncomfortable.
I listened and took a great deal of influence from a chap that was firmly in bed and had photos and all that with a chap who had Russian influences and history, which I never knew about.
You mean the meetings with the ambassador?
With Banks.
Yes, between Banks and the ambassador.
Yes, I just know. I'm just talking about Banks in particular.
There's again, that there's no evidence of wrongdoing at those meetings, is there?
None at all. But I can't help feeling that if he
feels a bit whiffy to you,
and was influenced by someone so close to funding the campaign, I just feel it's an uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable about it. I might be the only person out there who is.
I don't think you are the only person out there who is, Anthony. Thank you for the careful way that you made your point. Thanks very much indeed.